I don't usually dream. What's more, until I met Paul Bennett, I had never in my life had an experience which might be considered supernatural. I took life as I found it. I enjoyed my work and my pleasure. I expected a scientific explanation for everything. Anything of value which I have accomplished has been in the way off, shedding further light on obscure historical or literary events. I don't welcome mystery, I explain it away. In particular, I have exposed several frauds of a supposedly occult nature. Yet here I find myself sitting down a series of offense which defies rational analysis, perhaps the very recapitulation of what happened in chronological sequence will help towards further clarification. But I suspect not. When Emanuel Hillary died in October, I was surprised to find myself invited by his son John to attend the funeral. Very surprised indeed. I knew the son only slightly. We were at Sydney, Sussex together, though I think he was in fact a year my junior. At any rate, we went to some of the same clubs. The father I knew not at all, except from once attending his course off lectures on Italian architecture. John introduced us, and we had a drink together in the public house at the bottom of Mill Lane. In his last years old, Emanuel acquired the reputation of being a bit gaga. He squandered quite a lot off his considerable fortune on the restoration of a crumbling 18th century villa near Florence. He died there. At the time I happened to be living in a rented cottage not far away, in a village on the slopes of Monte Murillo. I was researching a book on Cagliostro, not really my line, but one must find a way of paying the butcher's bills. When the invitation came, I hesitated for an hour, then sent a note of acceptance. In the circumstances, a refusal might have seemed discourteous. Besides, I felt instinctively that there was something behind the invitation. John must want to see me. 30 years ago we had parted in Cambridge without so much as a handshake. Our only direct contact during the last decade was a club dinner after my series of radio talks on the occult. But I remembered him well as a man who did not suffer fools gladly, yet was himself more devious than intelligent. In urging me to visit his father's mansion, he undoubtedly had some motive more significant than wanting me to help eat up the baked meats, after sitting through a doleful church service in a faith that wasn't mine. The Villa Fabricati was hidden from the road. However much trouble Emanuel had taken, its situation was such that it could never suggest anything but damp and decay unless the thick wood which surrounded it were cut down. It was a rambling three-story affair with some Rococo additions. The basic design was rather vaguely Baroque. Some greenish creeper covered much off the outer wall and almost all off the gatehouse. The inner grounds were an unkempt wilderness of neglected fern and shrub. Hardly a cheerful place to die in, I reflected as my elderly Fiat plowed its way along the muddy drive after a morning storm. Although we were well into autumn, the weather had suddenly turned oppressive, and I noted with distaste almost approaching alarm the presence of clouds of great heavy insects, several of which crashed fatally into my windscreen, leaving nasty gray smears. It was nearly noon. I was the last to arrive. I noted with some amusement that the expectant beneficiaries were all present, although none of them lived nearer than Westminster. They looked like people who would take no chances. John welcomed me with rather exaggerated bonhomie. It quickly turned out that one of his reasons for asking me was that he hoped I would join him and 4 others as pallbearers on the short procession to the local church in Graveside. I nodded agreement, but thought he might have warned me. Some people think they need only to have an idea to see it done. He introduced his wife Madeleine, a middle-aged charmer, who looked well capable of getting her own way. Other so-called mourners included his elder sister Wanda and her husband Henry Marling, a beaky, avaricious-looking pair. Then there was Reginald Bell, Emanuel's other son, and Lovia, a daughter long deceased, and Eleanor Cavendish Warren, some sort of cousin, who was clearly approaching her 80s. We accomplished the business of the day as speedily as we could. A young male mutwaked in front of the coffin and all the women behind. Only the servants seemed genuinely moved. The family's tears were of the crocodile variety. Afterwards, there was a buffet back at the villa, giving me a further chance to observe my fellow guests as they masticated their rather disgusting hot osso bucco and cold garlic sausage, followed by what seemed to be a bread pudding of extremely leaden texture. For me, the coffee and strega were the only enjoyable part of the meal, and after that I was thinking of taking my leave when John, perhaps sensing this, came over to sit by me and offer another drink. Whatever else was in his mind couldn't seem to find expression, so to cover an awkward pause I asked, "Who is the little man in black with the long hands and pale eyes?" I gestured briefly at a sober figure dwarfed by the marble mantelpiece. He toyed solitarily with his coffee spoon. His well-cut coat was thigh-length and looked Edwardian. It was devoid of buttons or lapels. You couldn't help noticing his hands before anything else. Perfectly formed, with elegant fingers, they seemed to have been borrowed from a man twice his size. "That's Paul Bennett. He sat at the back off church. Interesting looking fellow. Is he French?" "Half that and half Spanish, I think. He kind off goes with the house. Father found him a few years ago in New York, working in one of the museums, and took him on as a sort of librarian, companion. It seems he specializes in occult manuscripts, of which we now have quite a collection at the expense of the family fortunes, mostly quite unreadable and unsaleable, I think. As a matter of fact, that was my main reason for asking you over. So it was out at last. I tried to look politely inquisitive. I have to go back to London in a couple of days, and I'm afraid business must go on even in the presence of death. I meant to licken, firmed me previous impression of John as a sanctimonious hypocrite. After all, there are thousands of quite valuable books here, and I'm a complete Philistine. The family is rather afraid that Bennett may try to get his hands on the choicest items, and I wondered whether you'd be free to put some sort of valuation on them, give us a quick indication anyway. John was trying to smile. You know, tell us which ones to lock away. I raised an eyebrow non-committally. I could do that, I suppose. I didn't want to offend you by offering a fee, though do say if you'd like one. I thought you might prefer to take your pick of the books, say 500 quids worth, or 750 if you like. You might even enjoy yourself. I pursed my lips. It's an agreeable enough suggestion, and I'd be glad to spend a day or two at it, especially with a bottle from your cellar to lay the dust at lunchtime. But what about Bennett? Won't he resent my poaching on his territory? John instantly showed his true colors. Bennett be damned. He's a servant in this house, and he'll do what he's told. The fact is, we none of us trust him. Matty thinks he was trying to set the old man against us. However, it's over now before any harm off. That kind could be done. I've already seen the will, though we have to wait for formal reading tomorrow. He collected himself and looked a little sheepish. I say, am I delighted you'll help us? Are you sure you wouldn't prefer a proper business arrangement? I shook my head. Your first suggestion will be fine, and I promise not to cheat. 5 volumes off my choice, to a total not exceeding £500. Came back next morning at 10, only to learn that the family lawyer had been delayed in Milan by some urgent court case, so the family mourners had to hang on and were clearly not happy about it. Nor was I, as it meant we'd all have to lunch together. John wasn't in, so the butler showed me straight to the library, a tall, musty room with a richly ornamented ceiling. Its walls were crammed with decorated oak shelving, 2 banks of which projected into the center to be joined by an ornamental arch. Left alone with a flask of coffee, I opened some windows and set to work. Off 7,000 odd books in the room, I quickly calculated that more than half were too modem to have any significant value, so I noted the position off, rest, and got busy in them. Despite a certain orderliness in some sections, the Dewey system had been adopted. Some sections seemed very curiously classified. Suddenly, my attention was drawn by 3 bulky, abridged copies of Fraser's The Golden Bough, in different ornamental editions. I stepped into the alcove which housed them, and found myself surrounded by a vast number of volumes on the occult, constituting in total so great a proportion of the library as to overbalance it completely. They range from paper, covered how-to-do-it manuals of conjuring tricks to a few privately printed volumes off black magic rituals, including an item which totally took my breath away, a complete 17th century rubric for the Black Mass. There were books about spirit raising, zombies and voodoo, human sacrifice, witchcraft through the ages, and every other aspect of the supernatural you might think often a nightmare. An odd collection indeed to find in the house of a man just buried, who presumably might have gleaned from his library enough skills to transcend the barrier of death. My attention was suddenly distracted by a light slapping or clapping noise. I was so concealed by the alcove that I might have been hiding there. I stepped out to find Bennett standing at one of the open windows which surveyed the terrace. He had his long tapering hands half stretched out before him, almost as though he was applauding. I couldn't see any sense in the action at first, then I realized what he was doing. I have mentioned the very furry insects which banged and squashed themselves against the windshield of my car on my first arrival. It seemed now that there was a small swarm of them outside the window, and Bennett was catching them in his hands. Not killing them with a clap, but capturing them in his deft long fingers, cupping them carefully one at a time, and transferring them to a kind of glass case which stood on a nearby desk, opening and closing it while he inserted the struggling insect with a stylish flick off High's supple fingers. As I moved closer, I could see fluttering inside the case half a dozen of the unpleasant creatures, and a couple more dead on the bottom. Suddenly he became aware of my presence, and was so startled that he let his last captive free. It flew off into a dark green bush. "What on earth do you want those things for?" I asked almost involuntarily. His eyes rolled a little, his mouth opened silently, and he shook his head from side to side. "It is nothing," he murmured. "An experiment, only an experiment, and you were looking for something." Something about the way he looked up at me suggested a dog which knows it is about to be beaten. Something else suggested a dangerous animal about to spring in its own defense. In that second, Bennett's whole personality seemed to be exposed. I knew that I could never forget the slightly hunched shoulders, the crew-cut hair, the sallow complexion, the suspicion of an accent in his otherwise impeccable English diction. I judged him to be in his mid-40s, though there were aspects which might have made him 20 years younger or 10 years older. I was repelled by the hatred which clearly seethed in his pale eyes. Yet I had no doubt whatever that he had cared more than any member of the family for the well-being of old Emmanuel. He had that distrust of outsiders which is the hallmark of perfect servant. Blood may be thicker than water, but love is thicker than either, and devotion to duty is a kind of love. So I admired him, yet there was something unsettling about him. I feared him, yet I understood him. The truth is perhaps that I instinctively sensed between us a kind of empathy, despite the fact that it would have been difficult to find two human beings more outwardly different. I stress the word empathy rather than sympathy. My feeling was only that somehow Bennett and I were on the same plane. We would understand each other yet not necessarily agree. This feeling of mine, after only a few seconds of conversation, seems more than a little related to the curious events which followed. I quickly discovered that even though John may have mentioned my likely presence in the library, he had not explained it. Privately cursing my college friend, I spun Bennett a yam about John's wanting to make use of presence often alleged expert to give a general view on the interest of the collection. Bennett listened attentively, but was clearly not convinced. He shrugged politely at my apology for trespassing on his preserves, and finally shook his head. "It is not your fault, not at all. I am aware that they do not trust me." His eyes opened wider in private amusement, and the pupils gleamed. "But they may find that there is a small surprise waiting for them, and then the world will know whom Emmanuel really trusted." There seemed no answer to so naive a threat. The words had been delivered lightly, yet they chilled and silenced me. I thought afterward that perhaps he had not intended me to hear them. Perhaps the truth was that he did not care whether I heard them or not. abruptly turned from me and left the room, making no more noise than the breeze which whistled outside among the cypresses. As the door closed behind him, my eyes fell to the strange little glass case in which a few insects still struggled while 5 now lay dead. I forced myself to examine the species more closely. Horrible things they were, something over an inch long, with long-jointed flea-like legs, a furry abdomen, and wavering antennae. What could be Bennett's purpose in collecting such revolting objects, deciding that more prolonged study of them would spoil my appetite for lunch? I made to return to my task. As I did so, my hand touched a book which was lying open on the comer of Bennett's desk. It was in French. The title was La Transference du Mort. The funeral had been on a Wednesday. I worked on the library throughout Thursday and the first part of Friday. It was toward lunchtime on that day the bombshell dropped. I was aware that the lawyer from Milan had arrived, and that he was in conclave with the family. It had just occurred to me to wonder whether the will had contained any surprises when I heard the scrape off several chairs on the parquet floor upstairs. As I crossed the hall with the intention of washing my hands and taking a stroll before lunch, John came running down the staircase in an excess of bad temper. His face was like a thunderstorm. He had to say something as I innocently confronted him. What he said was, "Bennett's got it, the whole damn lot, may the old man rot in hell. I never sought the whys and wherefores of the business. There was no putting up with the gloomy vindictiveness of the family any more than with the gleeful triumph of Bennett." As I packed up, taking with me only 2 books instead of 5 agreed, John told me Merilith, that 2 wills had been found. The first gave the house to John and divided the fortune fairly evenly between him and the rest of the family, with a decent but not overwhelming bequest for Bennett. The second and later document, lodged with the lawyer only weeks before the old man's death, left everything, apart from small gifts and charitable donations, on condition ally to Bennett. Not only did the family fail to get what they expected, none of them was even mentioned. For the next month or more my literary researches took me only briefly to London, then I was off again to Liechtenstein, San Marino, and finally Copenhagen. Occasional phone calls to friends kept me current with what was happening in the Bennett affair. Predictably, the will was being contested by the family on the grounds that the old man was often sound mind when he made it. I passed through Florence in early December and once drove past the old house, but it seemed empty, though the old padre whom I met in the street told me that so far as he knew Ben, it was still in residence. Just in time for Christmas I flew home. Among the letters awaiting me was a note from John to let me know that the second will had been successfully revoked, and that Bennett had been given notice to quit. It was during that night that the dream came to me. I would have attributed it to tiredness, overreading, or incipient influenza had it not been so vivid, like a beautifully photographed film. It began with Bennett's face in what I suppose I have to call close up. Heavily shadowed, malign, evil, he was saying something which I could not quite catch, but then the camera drew back and there was I, with my back to it, listening to him. We were in the library of Villa Fabricati, standing near his desk by the window. He wore what appeared to be the same black suit, the one with no lapels, and rather to my surprise he seemed to be drunk. With the curious certainty of dreamers, I ascribed his condition, for some unknown reason, to the effects of Calvados. Some of the shelves were empty, but the occult section was undiminished. Most of the furniture was thick with dust. Even in my dream, the atmosphere was unbearably claustrophobic. I longed to get out into the fresh air. A small bed in the cummer had been slept in but not made up. You live very simply, I said, my voice echoing around the room. Now I could hear him. Simply, my friend, he hissed. It is the others who are simple. Bennett won before, and he will win again. You know my plan. Now I shall carry it out. Plan, I said vaguely. What plan do you mean? But he had already turned away to the desk, and when he faced me again, his hands held the wooden box with glass panels in which I had seen him trap the gray insects. I took a step backwards in revulsion, but it was full off damned things still. I shall show you, my friend. Said Bennett, almost maniacally. What good friends these creatures are, how they help to ensure that justice is done. The Hillarys think they have one, but my reach is longer than they can imagine. Watch. I can't remember exactly how he did it without freeing all the insects, but suddenly he selected one and held it by the wings, so it struggled between the fingers off High's left hand. A truly monstrous sight in the precise detail now afforded to me. With his free hand, Bennett drew from some part of his clothing a long pin. What the devil? I exclaimed. Bennett smiled almost sweetly. Precisely, he said, driving the pin through the body of the insect, which reacted violently before shuddering into lifelessness. You see before you the remains of Mr. John Hillary. Was truly shocked. You raving lunatic, I said viciously. Bennett grinned foolishly at me, sweat standing out on his forehead as he held aloft on its pin his little victim. We shall see, he murmured with a sudden appearance of exhaustion. And now, my friend, I think you had better leave. Was running in fear down the overgrown drive, and behind suddenly I heard insane, helpless, convulsive laughter, which I knew to be Bennett's. In my mind's eye, I saw him opening a drawer in which, carefully laid out on white silk, were 6 small circles off-colored material, edged with darker thread. On one off these he laid the insect he had killed and closed the drawer. Superimposed on this image there faded in an eye old-fashioned newsboy walking quickly through the streets, waving at passers-by and shouting, "John Hillary dead, John Hillary dead." Woke up at this point and hurried for a bath as hot as I could stand it. Anything to wipe away the memory off that dream. I took along, suffering wife, who had by agreement retired before my midnight arrival, a cup oftia. She promised breakfast in 30 minutes. Meanwhile, still obsessed by the dream, I felt that I must try to contact John Hillary and see that he was in good health. It worried me that much. I had his Hayward's Heath number in my book and dialed it twice, but there was no reply. I looked up the London phone book, but there were 5 John Hillarys. By the time breakfast was ready, I was feeling somewhat calmer, but as my wife poured the tea, she remarked, after asking about my trip home, "By the way, didn't you say something last time you were home about meeting some people called Hillary, John and Madeline? I nearly burned my mouth on the tea." "Yes, I went to his father's funeral. What about them?" "I'm sorry to say they were killed in an air crash. It was in yesterday's paper. I kept it for you." I grabbed the newspaper with an apparent rudeness which astonished my wife. There indeed were their names among 38 victims of the Paris air crash I'd heard about, with enough further detail to identify them beyond doubt. All shocks fade. I had ceased to think very much about the event, and had almost forgotten my dream, when in mid-January I noticed in the Times obituaries the rather unusual name of Eleanor Cavendish, Warren. There was no doubt that she was the Hillary I had met. Though 78, she had died suddenly and unaccountably while wintering on Cap Ferrat. Later in the month, I read casually of a fatal car accident involving one Henry Marling and his wife. It took me a whole afternoon to remember where I had heard the name before. I felt like a man trapped in a recurring nightmare. Of all the beneficiaries under old Emmanuel's will, only one was still alive, Reginald Bell. I had to warn him, yet I knew almost nothing about him. Remembering, I thought, his saying that he was an architect, I finally tracked him down to an office in the city. His secretary, when she answered, was reserved, sorrowful, and proper. She was sorry tell me that on Litwo days ago her employer had succumbed to a heart attack while holidaying on a Nile cruise. I was afraid to go back to Florence. I was afraid of meeting Bennett. It was the end of May before I made the journey, on account of a final piece of research which could only be achieved there. My wife came with me, not exactly for protection, but because I didn't want even to think about my previous visit. On arrival, however, the city and countryside seemed so serene that my fears vanished, and 2 days later I was recklessly driving along the main street of Monte Perito, approaching the gateway to the Villa Fabricati. My sensitive stomach rumbled distinctly as I pulled up near a sign informing me that the place was to let or for sale. I asked some nearby workmen if the knuth had happened to Paul Bennett. Yes, they said, he was dead. Found in the grounds on the morning he was due to pack up and go. stiff as a board, with a purple face and a terrible expression on it. They didn't know what happened to the books, but a lot of articles from the house, apart from the very valuable ones which had been taken away, had been put up by the lawyers for sale through a local merchant. I found the shop without difficulty and wandered uneasily around it. I recognized odd pieces of occasional furniture, including a wrought iron standard lamp which had been in the hall. I was about to leave when in a comer, resting on the second shelf of a whatnot, I glimpsed an object which riveted me to the spot. Despite my revulsion, I had to walk over and pick it up. It was a glass dome about 6 inches high, and its contents had last been seen in my dream. Sticking up from the base on a wire frame were arranged what might have been 6 tiny, grotesque dolls. They wore gaily colored capes and looked as though they were about to play ring-a-roses. At first and even second glance, it was possible not to notice that the dolls were really insects.